Yeah, I'm going to pick up on from where Dale left off and address the question of class independence in my presentation. I've titled the presentation "The Class Politics, Worker Community Alliances and Participation." Before I proceed, though, I need to connect my presentation to the overall theme of this conference. And I just want to highlight a particular question of what does the public actually mean. And for me, we need to not do away with, but we need to challenge an abstract term like the public, because it can be put to different uses. So for me, the working class is predominantly the public. In terms of dealing with public housing services, public works, transport and health, the working class has a particular angle. And if we take into account that neoliberalism was a particular class response to the crisis of capitalism in the 1970s, we need a counter strategy to neoliberal capitalism that has to be class-based. Okay. I want to introduce you to a project that was initiated in 2012 that involved SAMU, the Housing Assembly, and ILRIC. My presentation in Alton, I'm going to discuss the project and look at the challenge of worker community alliances in respect of the project. Look at also the question of what are the aims of participation. The project was about joint participation in the IDP and municipal budget processes in Cape Town. And then I want to go on to conclude some lessons from the project for what we have generally called the NUMSA moment. So the aims of this joint project was to capacitate participants to critique the City of Cape Town's IDP and budget, and to jointly engage the CCT on the IDP and the budget. A secondary but important aim was to develop relations of trust, obviously, between some worker leaders and housing activists, and then to go on to agree to other joint activities of the two constituencies. The main project activities included a series of training sessions. I think we had about 13 or 14 altogether. In the course of, I think, roughly about an 18-month period, we put together a joint submission and a joint memo, and we had a joint march, which was a march around the Extended Public Works program in Cape Town, where a group of EPWP workers approached SAMU, knocked on their doors and said, we don't like this kind of contract work, it's 3 months long, no benefits, no pay, we need your assistance. So the Housing Assembly, through the project, got drawn into a march, and we put together a joint memo for that particular handover on the march. So the participants on the project, there were 40 in all, roughly half of whom were some worker leaders, and half were Housing Assembly activists. The aims of the training included developing the conceptual tools of a class analysis, which went into then a critique of the IDP and a critique of the municipal budget. The key themes of the training included understanding class society. We looked at the San hunter-gatherer society, and then looked forward in terms of the emergence of class society, and tried to discuss who are human beings? How did they arrive at a class society after living for something like 95% of the time as primitive, to use Marx's term, communists? So we were all communists once. And to engage the existing neoliberal capitalist class structure through the prism of history, and to talk about what does it mean to struggle for freedom, etc., from the standpoint, if you like, of the earlier form of communism and looking forward. We looked at capitalism and how it works, the nature of the state and government under capitalism. We highlighted key features of neoliberal capitalism. We began to talk about what is neoliberal about the city, what is neoliberal about your area, and I think the comrades began to get a sense of identifying what was literally under their noses all along, and to begin to talk about struggle against the different forms of the life that invades our day-to-day existence in so many different ways. Of course, we had to look at the question of inequality and neoliberalism, the fact that the city is number 19 on the list of the most unequal cities in the world. We looked at what neoliberalism is as an ideology, what social democracy is, and then we introduced people to socialism through a short piece by Rosa Luxemburg, which I find very, very useful. The overall theme, if you like, of the training sessions was trying to define the view from the bottom of the class pyramid. Having said all of that, there were a number of limitations to the project. I mean, the project was largely around the training workshops. We had a number of other difficulties. The project was with the Metro branch, and for a period of time, the Metro branch went into a bit of conflict and turmoil. I'm not going to go into any details. In addition, the EPWP campaign that got off to what we thought was a good start in the light of the upheaval and conflict within the Metro branch, it stalled for a long time. I don't think it's been resuscitated since. In addition to that, in that period from 2012, within the Housing Assembly, we were still working towards the launching of the Housing Assembly. Grassroots organization was still relatively weak. And all in all, there was patchy involvement of individual SAMRO members in the Housing Assembly activity. So those are the limitations, if you like, and the background to the limitations of the project. So what did this project experience teach us about the challenge of alliances between worker leaders and housing activists? Dale has covered much of what I wanted to say about the relationship between SAMRO and social movements, but I'm going to move on. All in all, the period spent together involved a fascinating chemistry between the participants. There was a huge amount of camaraderie interaction that developed over the sessions. The debates were robust, especially around the Alliance and the ANC. But constituencies got to know each other in the course of the project. When I did evaluation, people filled in evaluation forms, there were frequent references to mutual respect for each other, how much Housing Assembly activists could learn from some worker leaders, and how much worker leaders in turn felt respect for the struggles of unemployed people around housing and services and conditions in the township. But I think all in all, the need for unity, the need to sustain the project was agreed by all. Some of the tensions between the constituencies, Dale has referred to generally, but it came out very, very clearly in the course of the sessions. The social distance between permanent workers who are members of unions and union leaders, and the unemployed, low-income workers, those involved in insecure and irregular work. A range of differences in terms of organizational experience, organizational resources. Those were all things that were teased through, and I think people learned a lot from the overall engagement. On the question of the nature of participation in municipal processes, there have been different views on this particular question. I wanted to just pick up on three particular types of responses. There are those who see participation as a means of collaborating or entering into partnership with government. There are others, maybe not large in number, but those who argue that one should keep one's distance from the state. Basically, it's a stance of disengagement. This project, I think, took the view that it is important to engage the state in order to develop class politics and class consciousness. In the paper, one line says, absent in the debates on participation is an explicit consideration of complex class politics, working class unity and power generally, intra-working class alliances and the coalition power that accumulates to workers when they unite in concerted actions across space and scale. Obviously, again, Dale has made reference to this already, but I've just used different verbs to describe what neoliberal capitalism has done in terms of impacting on working class consciousness and organization. It divides, it atomizes, demobilizes. I think depoliticizes is one aspect that often is not highlighted, but I think that's ingrained in neoliberal capitalism. And we need to articulate that in much more explicit terms. The divisions within the working class, especially in the townships, are clear. But the point about a joint project is, how does the working class in all its different, with all its different newly constituted constituencies, how does it come together and become a combined force that overrides the tensions, the divisions, etc. And in the course of that kind of engagement, through struggle, through building organization, that consciousness, the class consciousness, the awareness of being a force of power in society that can actually take over society, so to speak, in its own majority name. I think that elements of that obviously came out through the training. But we know that class consciousness is not something that one learns in workshops. It's about the wider struggle, the building of organization, mass action, and the confluence of different forces coming together in united struggles. I'm not going to go into the theory of class consciousness, but I want to pick out some of the key aspects of becoming, of the housing assembly, for example, becoming a citywide movement. When housing struggles have been the highest proportion of struggles in the protests that have taken place, the biggest issue has been housing. But very often these are localized struggles and people fight about being first in the waiting list queue, for example. But in the city of Cape Town, you have 460,000 households who live in bad housing conditions officially. And one fights in one corner over housing allocation, when every year something like 12,000 houses are allocated, and the housing backlog actually increases by a further 10 to 15,000 every year, then we know that there's a problem in terms of how communities need to address the question of the lack of housing. So becoming citywide is part of that process of moving away from what I would call narrow, opportunist way of looking at things. And we've seen it in other kinds of struggles as well. I will use, for example, the struggles over boundaries, over provincial boundaries. The Meraform struggle has been highlighted. But that struggle was about becoming part of a rich province, namely Gauteng, and not being part of a poor province. The simple fact is not everybody can live in a poor province, in a rich province. And so when we struggle in a narrow way, the aims, the perspective becomes narrow and short-sighted, and we need to move, obviously, the scope and the scale of struggle needs to be expanded to a citywide level, to a provincial level, and ultimately onto a national level. Okay, I'm going to round off now. We know that we've entered a new moment, from the local protest to Marikana and the strike wave over 2012, 2013, to the current NUMSA moment. There are all kinds of new favorable circumstances that have taken shape in the recent period. The Housing Assembly from 2012, when the project was initiated, has begun to shape. It launched with 320 delegates about 3 weeks ago. It's emerged as a grassroots organization in the 5 districts that Cape Town has been carved up into. There's a leadership core that is emerging in all districts. There are new struggles that are breaking out on a day-to-day basis. The Housing Assembly, over a lengthy period of about 4 years, when we were still just a Housing Assembly in name, workshopped a whole series of questions related to housing policy, its neoliberal character, and that has gone into the founding documents of the Housing Assembly. In the light of the NUMSA moment, we're launching a campaign for decent housing, which is not just going to to be about the Housing Assembly, but we need to open the doors to all mass organizations that want to support this campaign, and hopefully organizations like NUMSA, SAMU, even SACTU, the other COSATU affiliates will become part of that particular campaign. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.